Erica is going to be our panel moderator today, so she's going to keep everyone in check, right, Erica?
Yeah, I'm going to do my best.
Erica's lectured extensively on the topic of anime, including at MIT, Harvard, Kanagawa University, and others. She's edited manga for J Manga, Udon Entertainment, Seven Seas, and most recently Ryoko Ikeda's classic, The Rose of Versailles. Darren Ashmore, give us a wave, Darren. A little nod there. He's from the UK, but is currently head of Japan studies at Yamanashi Gakuin University. His main area of research is Japanese media arts, especially the literature, theatre and film of the 60s to the 80s. And he has been extremely helpful with Bonham's putting this cell together with his amazing knowledge about cells and drawings in the anime world. So thank you, Darren. Susan, up there, give us a wave. Susan Napier is the Goldthwait Professor of Rhetoric and Japanese at Tufts University, where she teaches such courses as a seminar on Hayao Miyazaki and a course comparing Walt Disney Studios with Studio Ghibli, which I would love to hear, but that's for another day. She's the author of many articles and books, the most recent of which is Miyazaki World, A Life in Art, which was published in 2018. And finally, we have Helen McCarthy. There we go. Helen's like our OG anime expert. She has been researching Japanese animation and pop culture since 1981. She's written many books on the topic, including the first book in English on anime, and works on Hayao Miyazaki and Osamu Tezuka. She co-authored the Anime Encyclopedia, which is recognized as a foundation text for anime both in the West and in Japan. So we're very pleased to have you all. Erica, I'm going to pass over to you. I think Elizabeth wanted to say a little something about how the panel works, super quick with the questions.
Yes, definitely. We see there's a lot of participation in the chat box already. That's great. Nice to meet all of you. We'll be using the Q&A. If anyone has questions as we're going through the panel, feel free to submit them in there, and we'll be monitoring on our end. And we do have some time allotted at the end to open it up for audience Q&A. So with that, Erica, we'll let you get started.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody at Bonham's for sponsoring us today. Thank you for everybody for joining us today, and we're looking forward to this. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to get right into this. We're going to begin today with an introduction to anime, and Susan is going to whisk us through a history of anime in a short discussion. So Susan, why don't you take that away?
Thank you, Erica. Yes, I've been asked to give you history of Japanese anime in the last 100 years or so in about 5 minutes, maybe with a few seconds here or there. So without more ado, I'm going to not cover pre-war anime, although it does exist. And it's interesting in that it has some of the, you can see where anime's roots are coming in. It's actually quite imaginative, and it draws on a lot of legends and myths, but it also has gags and some clever sequences. And it's a good start for what would really become the anime industry in the post-war period. And I really want to go first to this magic moment in 1958 when Toei Anime, which is a recently created studio from the larger Toei studio, produces its first full-color, full-length animation, a film called let's see, Hakujaden in Japanese, and it's many different translations, but I think Legend of the White Serpent is the most famous. Toei's anime was trying to become the Disney of the East. Never quite became that, perhaps just as well, but it was an enormous force remains an enormous force throughout anime history. And we have a number of examples from it in this auction, which is not surprising because they've been around since 1958. And they go from everything from this Legend of the White Serpent to shonen boys anime such as Dragon Ball Z, or of course shoujo anime, the Sailor Moon series. So they're an important and continuing force. But what I really want to zero in on for one moment is a snowy night in 1958, when a young man recently graduated in politics and economics goes off to watch this movie, Legend of the White Serpent, and comes home shaken. And in fact, spends all night crying because he's so impressed by it, by the beauty, the gorgeousness of the animation, which was very impressive for 1958 Japan, and for the purity and sweetness and heartwarmingness of the story and the characters. And this young man was, of course, Hayao Miyazaki. So we can see that Toei has just been a kind of world-changing force in so many ways, because Miyazaki would go on to found Studio Ghibli, one of the most important animation studios ever. But before we get to Ghibli, just a few other things in relation to that period, the late 50s and early 60s, when Toei is riding high with a lot of feature-length animation. We have another person and another studio coming up, and that is Tezuka Osamu, who I know Helen knows a great deal about, but just to say he's considered the god of manga, because he was originally a manga artist, and then really in many ways considered the god of anime as well, because Tezuka is responsible for giving us Astro Boy and many, many, many other enormous variety of anime, and also for pioneering this very distinctive style of animation called limited animation, which is much cheaper to do, far fewer cells per minute compared to, say, Disney or the Western animation, but having a very distinctive style, and again, a marvelous protean imagination with all kinds of stories, from robots to a lion in the jungle. So Tezuka, it's not surprising we have some beautiful frames of Tezuka's work in the auction, including Astro Boy, the sort of iconic figure of Japanese animation to many in America as well as in Japan. Then just briefly, we have with Tezuka and this whole new kind of quick limited animation coming in, television starts taking an interest in anime, and you have a number of very important studios, small independent studios coming on, Tatsunoko, Piero. I'm going to just briefly go to 1970s, when we have a first big moment in fan culture, which is Space Battleship Yamato, which is another iconic work where you have for the first time a kind of Star Wars type phenomenon with fans kind of lining up the night before to see this amazing kind of space science fiction epic. And to go then into the 1980s, we have the founding of Studio Ghibli, based on or supported by the success of Nausicaa, which is not from Studio Ghibli, but from Topcraft. But the people who made it, Miyazaki Hayao, with the help of Takahata Isao, and were the ones who then founded Studio Ghibli, which is, I say, probably one of the most important animation studios in the world now, or over the last few years. And although it's small compared to Disney, the kind of quality of art, the incredible, really distinctiveness and uniqueness of the stories. Ghibli, unlike many anime studios, does not take kind of pre-packaged manga success stories. They usually, particularly Miyazaki, writes his own manga or creates his own work, and sometimes uses literature. And these people know their literature. They're from French background, French literature background, history, economics. They're very interesting people who are involved in the anime industry in Japan, not just Ghibli, but just amazing, the number of fascinating people behind the anime. And I'm going to finish up with one last studio that I think is very important, which is Gainax. And Gainax was responsible for one of the truly great anime series, I believe, in history, which is Neon Genesis Evangelion, written and directed by Hideaki Anno, who actually worked with Miyazaki for many, many years before that on Nausicaa. And finally, it was the voice of Jiro in The Wind Rises. And Gainax's Evangelion is really an amazing moment in anime history. It's dark, it's beautiful, It's very, very psychologically intense. It's everything that you wouldn't expect if you're used to Western animation. And it certainly has, of course, it inspired other anime since then. The Attack on Titan and Makoto Shinkai's kind of ethereal works. So this is, in a very brief nutshell, the kind of variety and quality and imagination that you'll see in Japanese anime and the people who created it.
And not coincidentally in this auction, which has a tremendous breadth of all of these works and these creators. So thank you very much, Susan. Darren, I think I'm going to turn to you next, and we're going to ask you, can you tell us what goes into making an anime production and how are cells produced?
Production is a controlled mess. Dozens of people trying to work on all manner of different scenes at once, and it all comes down to these little flimsy bits of cellulose acetate. Where they come from, though, it's something of a story in itself. You'll probably be aware that old film stock was made out of a material which ultimately degraded and would burn, which is why perhaps 90% of all films ever shot burned up sometime before the 1930s. Animation's the same. About 1905, 1906, when animation took off commercially all over the world, cells didn't exist. Drawings would be penciled one at a time on paper, colored, and then redrawn and redrawn and redrawn. This is why old animation looks so jittery. But 1915, Bray Studios over in the US, people started to use standard, I think it was 4:3 ratio sheets of first pure cellulose and then later cellulose acetate. This would have an image inked in black or later Xeroxed onto one side. People would then flip it and either use initially a sort of gum Arabic based paint or later acrylic to block in colors one by one. If anyone turns over a cell, you'll just see a royal mess on the back. But turn it round and the reverse process of applying foreground colors and background one after another creates something, as you can see, very special.
Excellent, thank you.
How it's created, though, let me drop a couple of key terms into chat for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, no. Can I? Hopefully this will be visible to everyone. You'll see the term seruga coming up in the auctions from time to time. This is just the Japanese term for a cell, a celluloid picture. But before that, each sequence in a film is blocked out into relatively short runs of perhaps no more than a minute. And even that is a monumental piece of work. And these are led off by interesting pieces called genga, some of which I do believe are in the auction as well, as along with other pieces of work. The genga define particular scenes and are created by lead artists. In the case of Ghibli, sometimes by Miyazaki himself, which is why Ghibli genga always seem to vanish as soon as they pop up. From those sketches, which establish tone and character form, other artists will create something called doga. Now, technically that's a moving picture, but what they are used for is to create the black line images, which are then photocopied onto cells to create each individual. But doga tend to appear only in a few cells known as key cells. These are the cells which start and end sequences. Now, this is largely because production is so hectic that it is not possible to get a complete sequence storyboarded out. But if the animators have the characters at the start and at the end of a particular run, they know where they are coming from, they know where they are heading towards, and they have the Genga to provide them a basic outline, color matching, Pantone numbers, and so on.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Darren, for that overview. And Helen has copied all the terms and the definitions in the Japanese into the chat for folks who are looking for that. Helen, I'm going to ask you to do the quickest version of, can you give us an idea of what the evolution of anime spreading into the West has been?
Well, first of all, I have great shoes to follow with Susan and Darren, so I'll be as concentrated as I can. The anime spreading into the West is actually much easier to talk about because it's only a very small quantity of the anime actually made. Someone said in the chat earlier about a particular title that she'd noticed. I've never heard of this title before. You'll find that with about, I guess, most Westerners, even anime fans, have never heard of between 45 and 60% of all anime released in Japan. That's a huge number, but we only see what Western distributors choose to buy, and they only buy what they think we will go for. Obviously, it's a business before it's anything else. We actually started to see anime quite early on. In the US, it was on TV from 1963. Yeah, from the summer of 63, 6 months after Tetsuwan Atom appeared in Japan on the 1st of January.
So really, that's like almost
America.
immediately.
Yeah,
in
almost
bigger time.
immediately. Yeah, much shorter times than we'd experienced later in distribution. And that caused quite a stir, but America already had cartoon animation on TV. So it was a new kind of cartoon animation, but it wasn't a new kind of technique. Limited animation was something America was familiar with. And it was adapted by a team that America knew well, headed by the great Fred Ladd, with many famous cartoon voice actors. We went on in America in about the next 10, 15 years to have many, many more animations coming in, both dubbed from Japan and made for American audiences, so dubbed originally in English. But the big hit in America was 79 when Star Blazers, the adaptation of space battleship Yamato, burst on the screen. And if you talk to so many people in animation and in comics of say 40 to 60 something today, they
Gen
will
X.
talk about racing home from high school and skidding in front of the TV. And, you know, the house was Star Blazers from then on.
Yep.
It was epic. Now, over in Britain, we had anime from the mid 60s with a totally different setup, Marine Boy, which was a portmanteau show of 2 shows about undersea heroes stitched together and was hugely popular. Again, I still know Brits in the 40 to 60 age band who can hum you the theme tune when you say Marine Boy, and who have little in-jokes about oxygum, which is what Marine Boy took to let him swim underwater without an aqualung. But France was doing better than us from the get-go, because not only did France have many, many small cinemas in large towns that took Japanese animated films and subtitled them into French, but they also began to have anime on TV as early as the mid-60s, partly because of a cultural tie-up between a number of influential people in French TV and a number of people in Japan. But their big moment, their epic moment, came in 74, when Goldorak was put on summer TV in France for kids. Kids aren't expected to be sitting looking at it. They're expected to be out in the weather, enjoying themselves with their friends in the long vacation. Instead, they were all sitting at home, glued to this bonkers, violent Japanese cartoon. It's Go Nagai's Mazinger Z. And Goldorak became such a cultural hit that, again, within 6 months, it was on the front covers of major journals like Paris Match, influential literary magazines, influential cultural magazines. It was huge. And so we had this big wave of anime flooding the West, Italy, France, Belgium, Britain, America. And then nothing much happened because, you know, kids' tastes change and toys go in and out of fashion. And it was difficult then for anyone to love what they loved except in memory. Remember, we didn't have video. We didn't have cinemas that regularly showed, as in France, as they were still doing in France, anime. We didn't have anime on TV. And then in 1990, Akira hit us like a tidal wave. And Akira is the foundation of modern anime fandom, because that film, which despite being made in 1988, still holds up against any modern animation because it was so well and so expensively made,
Yes.
ignited everybody's imagination, sent the world crazy for anime. Now, since then, some distributors have been down some very unfortunate paths. I'm thinking of the early days of manga video in the UK when they deliberately set out to make anime look as controversial, as unparent friendly, and as violent and vicious as they could. I'm thinking of many, many companies that set out to make a living and failed and folded. We have a lot of corpses along the way of our fandom, but anime has hung in there. And now, of course, that broadband has hit, people can see anime quickly and cheaply and easily. They can access manga quickly and cheaply and easily. It's for fans today. This is living in paradise.
Yes.
They can see anything. Someone, Renata Rivera over in Tokyo, has just mentioned 15ing on screen. Let me just tell you what 15ing is. 15ing is the process of ensuring that a video released in Britain, which has to get a certification from the authorities, achieves a 15 age certificate. That means nobody under 15 can buy it. Now, the reason for this is that no self-respecting 10-year-old is going to buy a child's video.
Right.
He or she is going to buy a 15 video, a video for the cool kids.
Kids,
And the simple way, exactly. And the simple way to do 15ing is to make it as rude as possible. And my favorite classic line, which manga put into one show, which I think is deathless and should be engraved over the head of the current manga video chief executive, is, "I'm going to rip your head off and shit down your neck." That was nowhere in the Japanese script, but it was put in purely to secure a 15 certificate. So with the chaos of 15ing and the chaos of different standards and the eventual blessing of broadband, here we are in a world where finally everybody can watch pretty nearly whatever anime suits them. And that will only go on improving. I hope we're going to see more variety of anime. I hope we're going to see some of the anime that doesn't come over. It's going to be great. It is great now, but it's going to be even greater.
Yeah, and the change in what streaming has done for anime is actually fairly significant. Not only making access better, but it has also, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, changed to some extent, killed the act of cell making. So we'll talk about that in a bit, but let's talk a little bit about the market for anime right now. This is a bit of a roundtable. So Darren, you can give a Japanese point of view. Helen and Susan would love to hear American and European point of view here. How do you all feel that the market has shifted in the last decade or so, last 10 years? And what do you think have fueled this? There's been a lot of recent conversation. There was an article just this week in Forbes about how the demand for anime has increased so very much. And I'd like to hear a little bit about your perspectives on what you think has affected that. Susan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, as I mentioned at our practice session, I was a guest editor this last year for a journal called Macadamia, which probably a number of you are familiar with. And we were doing a special issue on otaku and fan culture. And one thing that is very interesting is we go from this very small, very tight, intimate fan base. And we also mentioned this in our session that, one of the great things about these cells is they were collected by fans, by people who really loved and knew what they were doing. This is not just some conglomerate coming in and throwing things out, at the hungry public. These are people who were really smart and cared a lot about what they were doing. Over the last, I've learned through reading the articles for this journal of Macadamia, is that there is now a real shift with sort of bigger players coming in and some real investment going into anime from America and in many more kind of collaborations. So there were collaborations over time from the beginning, but this time there seems to be a shift towards a richer, more sophisticated, and perhaps more powerful kinds of America, or this I know mainly about the States, American, Japanese collaborations, and also even American companies trying to create their own form of anime. Now, how this is all going to work out is something that I'm not sure of, but it is definitely a shift.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of what fans think of as mainstreaming. You know, just the fact that Netflix is the one that premiered the Sailor Moon Eternal movies. That's such an enormous shift from the, you know, sitting in a club in a school, you know, trying to catch that latest
exactly.
laser disc, right? So Helen, what do you think about how the market has changed? You talked a little bit about that, but let's talk a little bit about more modern days. How are you seeing those shift in the market
I
from your
think
side?
actually the shift in the market is always driven by two ancient principles. Markets always follow technology, and they always follow money. People tend to think technology leads markets, but in fact, until the technology is there, the market cannot exist.
Right.
So for instance, until broadband not only enabled fast streaming, but also enabled much better, much more widespread communication, there was not the opportunity for a lot of people in small towns all over Europe, all over America, to actually know about and access new anime. That was a major game changer. And the other thing, of course, is it follows money, and money isn't very innovative. Rich people like to do things that will make them richer for the most part. They're not crazy on doing things that would incur big losses unless it's tax loss. So once people in serious positions of power, people at the top of major entertainment conglomerates, people at the top of major investors, began to see that anime, driven by the latest technological shift in broadband, was making big money. They became interested in having a slice of that pie and growing the market as much as they could to take more and more money. I mean, streaming is a fantastically lucrative market, not for the artists, but that's another issue. So
always the other issue.
Yeah, once we got big companies like Disney looking at this and Sony looking at this, saying, Netflix looking at this and saying, I can make more money if I do that. What's the best, most effective way for me to do that? And of course now, because we have so many more tools at our disposal, even a company that has no Japanese speakers can find easily someone who can speak for them at a proper business level to a Japanese company. In the early days of buying rights, British companies were absolutely clueless about Japanese business, Japanese public relations, and the Japanese language. And a lot of difficulties were incurred because of that. But now you go online, you find a great translator, you check their credentials. The next day you're talking to whatever studio in Japan you wanted to talk to. They won't necessarily accept your offer, but you can talk to them. So I think that big intersection of money and technology in the last 10 years has been the major driver. And of course, now we have new money sources coming in with NFTs, which I hope we're going to get onto later, which again is a double-edged sword, but without that big intersection of big money and big tech, anime would still be a very small niche fandom.
I just wanted to mention something that, Erica, a term you used when we talked earlier, organic.
Yes.
For so many years, the growth of ancient anime has been organically and done from the grassroots. And now it really does seem like there's more of a kind of top-down
yes,
kind of control coming in. And that's very different.
And Darren, let's get you in here. Can you tell us a little bit about how the anime market is in Japan, and what are the growth and factors there?
I'll echo Susan. There has been a great shift away from creators and towards senior management and the cash that goes with what you might call cash cow trends. Every generation since
ever
laid his first works down, there's always been something of a generational shift, but it's not been as noticeable as it is now. Go back 10 years and it was all about idol bands, and that's only just beginning to die away. Now it's all fighting fantasy again. Who knows what the next wave will be?
Right. Isekai and came up, right? Exactly. But can I just jump in real quick, because I also feel like it's always going to be, the organic growth is always at the bottom, always. And we've seen the growth of web novels and web novels into light novels and visual novels, and that was all started down way back. It's sort of like garage kits and you know, and just all of it is people hanging out together and making something cool and new. And that eventually will always become co-opted if it becomes profitable. Then the corporations step in, right? Okay, so let's move on a little bit. We have a question here. Where are the collectors geographically, and what's fueled Western and US, but also the rest of the West appetite for collecting anime? Does anybody have any thoughts on what's fueling that? Where are the popularities coming from?
I was invited a few years ago when we could fly around the world easily. I was invited to dinner with my other half in a very plush, very ritzy Tokyo apartment by a senior production executive in a major record company. His hallway was lined with framed anime cells, and we're talking beauties. We're talking Gundam keyframes with their full backgrounds. We're talking Ghibli. I think I saw every Ghibli film that had been released till then, represented by 2 or 3 wonderful cells. We're talking really early robot production. This guy was an otaku to his core. And he sort of smiled and looked a bit sheepish because I was there to talk to him about something else altogether. And he smiled and said, this is where my heart is. And he said exactly that. He spoke wonderful English. He said, this is where my heart is. What I do for work, I do for work. And I really want to see this market develop. But this is my passion.
Right.
And
that's the word I feel like keeps being circled around.
Yeah,
at the heart of this, it's about passion.
Everywhere. I mean, you go into a schoolgirl's bedroom, and there'll be not necessarily anime cells because she may not have much money, but there'll be pages torn from her favorite magazine or cut from the magazine, pinned to the walls. At every level of this, it's been fueled by passion. And where you will find it and who collects is basically anyone who sets their heart on, I've got to have that Tenshi Muyo cell. All the way up to the guy who can say, there's an auction going on over at Bonham's. I've marked these 12 in the catalogue. See what you can get. Go up to the top of the estimate. You know, everyone. It's not money. It's passion.
Passion. Right. Susan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm just thinking my Nashika cell that I treasure so much was given to me by a student probably 25 years ago. And I recognize it was a wonderful gift at the time, but I'm not sure either of us knew exactly how super wonderful it is. And he probably picked it up at a convention. And I think, again, this is one thing that, to me, this Bonham's auction is such a interesting turning point because, you know, all along, I think most people were picking things up through conventions or through, again, sort of grassroots channels that they, you know, knew someone who collected. And this does seem to be, again, a very interesting shift that you mentioned the Forbes article sort of talking about investment in anime. It seems to me that there's a new group of potential collectors coming in, and that's a big change.
Yeah. Darren, would you tell us a little bit about what affects the availability of cells? And also, we've been getting a lot of questions about the volatility of cells and how they're best cared for.
The market, now that's an interesting one. My first cells came straight out of production company filing cabinets, sold off the back of the lorry, as it were, simply because the companies couldn't afford to get rid of them. Ghibli even got a quote, I remember it rightly, Renato will correct me, for an entire job lot of burning the Kiki stuff, and we're told you can't go around burning cellulose acetate. So they started splodging it out almost unthinkingly to shops like, you know, the immortal Sheffield Space Centre, one of the first places to actually buy merchandise, like, you know, buy a box of pencil cases, here have some free cells. That soon changed though. By 2001, you're getting a real art scene beginning to creep out into the West. But even then, things didn't really pick up, from my point of view, as a collector until after 2012, when Yamato 2199 revealed to the world that cells were pretty much a thing of the past.
Yep.
A friend of mine runs well, I say a friend, he's more like a pusher. He runs a little cell shop at the top of a weird place called Nakano Broadway.
Right, I was just waiting for somebody to mention Mandarake. Yeah, actually.
Yeah. Oh no, Mandarake hate this guy. He's tucked in the back corner, competing all their business, and he always has the good stuff.
There's the good stuff. Yes, I know which store you mean. Yes.
He's the chap I sold all my Ghibli stuff to. But the point is, up until 2012, I could afford something like 5-Star Stories or Rose of Versailles, a couple of dozen thousand yen. But after 2012, prices started to climb, and
Right.
he, along with other vendors at places like Comiket, blamed the overseas market. Collectors were vacuum sales straight out of Yahoo auctions, straight out of shop sites. And that has had the single biggest impact on price as far as a buyer is concerned.
Interesting.
I'm priced out of my own area of study. Renato, give me a trumpet.
That is a common experience, though, for most scholars of media. We very quickly get priced out of our own area of study.
It's very true. It's let's talk a little bit. We have just a few more minutes before we start taking some questions. So let's talk about sort of the fashion in cells and rare items. And we'll do this as a roundtable. So anyone jump in who wants. What contributes to the volatility of cell value? Let's talk about what's hot and why, and what we've seen over time. Helen, you want to start?
A lot depends on where you come into the market personally as a fan. I mean, there's a canon, just as there's a canon in literature or a canon in movies. There's a classic canon that people say you should collect, and you look at it and you look at the prices and you say, okay, Ghibli, no. Evangelion, no. You can't afford it. So you say, what do I like? And you start trying to collect that. Right. And so fashion drives the low end of the market, where shows are being tried out. We don't know yet if this will be a classic. Just being by Gainax didn't guarantee that Evangelion would become popular.
God, no.
We have to check out what will endure and what won't. And what happens is that a lot of fans get collections that will have sentimental value only, because they buy what they love, which is fantastic. Everyone should do that. And they love what they love, and they will keep that in a box till they're old and gray and moving stuff to make room for their kids' graduation photos, and then think, wow, that was great. But the art market, when that comes in, starts with the canon, and then starts looking at canon connections that will add value to other titles. So you might, for example, say, this Hideaki Anno guy, he's really big. But what about the other guys who worked with him? What have they worked on? There must be an added value in that. And so it begins to become more like the fine art market, where collectors looking for more and more value begin to examine more and more of the connections that we as scholars and as media enthusiasts can actually give them. And that's where it begins to build, in my view.
Yeah. Susan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking that this is really fascinating. The question of when collectibles become art. Yeah. I'm actually giving a talk at Oxford in a couple of weeks and I'm going to talk about the idea of aura in relation to both Disney and Ghibli works. And aura is supposedly something that is attached to something that's single, unique, authentic. And yet here we are, behind cells, which are of animation, which in themselves are sort of 2 degrees removed from life and, wood or steel or whatever. And I think we're, there's someone, I think Patty mentioned in the chat, the question of nostalgia. Particularly, I noticed we have a lot of, at Bonhams, it's a lot of Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon. Often that's very much attached to one's childhood. And so that's a kind of aura that is very special. I'm also, I don't know what's really happening with the more recent anime. I know there's some really fascinating, wonderful titles up there, and I'm sort of, some of them are just gorgeous. So I'm kind of curious as to whether they're being collected as much and who's collecting them, but I really don't know.
Right. And I think because we want to start taking some questions, but I want to real quick, Darren, can you just talk about how cells should be stored and displayed appropriately for people who are going to be bidding on the cells for this auction?
People have to remember that cells or cellulose acetate continues to decay all the time, even in a stable environment. It is always putting off fumes. No one really knows exactly how long the cell will last, but you can moderate it by a relatively stable, tight frame sealed as best you can to prevent circulation. UV glass, because the Xerox lines that will sit on front are definitely sensitive to UV light. And keep it dry, especially with older cells. Humidity will wreck gum arabic.
All right.
This is especially important if you've got either a background or possibly a doga stuck to the back of your ink. Do not, whatever you do, try to remove it without a conservator's assistance. But generally speaking, if you get a bit of standoff between the paint and the back of your frame and good UV glass, you'll be as good as anyone can be.
And what is the expected lifespan of a cell that's been appropriately preserved?
Well, the Getty collection has cells dating back to 1915 still, and they are just beginning to show absolute degradation. So
Okay.
possibly a century, and certainly more with post-war cells.
Right.
To say, it really depends on the composition of the material, the composition of the paints, and how well they've been kept away from direct sunlight.
Right. And possibly how well they were put together in the first place. Things are, we have a question not in the Q&A, but in the chat here. Are production cells different from non-production cells in value, and how are they different in terms of keeping them?
By non-production cells, you've got to think of two. There's the, what do we call them? The Fuchsega, the printed cells that tend to go in for promotional purposes. They can still be worth a great deal. For example, the famous Laputa set of, I think it was 12 cells that was put out by Ghibli in '86, can still fetch, if it's all complete, well over 40,000 yen.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
But for the most part, what they call sericeru, the serigraph cells, part printed, part hand-drawn, tending to be, what's the word, publication or advertising cells sent out to distributors and television companies. These two have a value, not just because they are hands-on artifacts, but because they are directly associated with a particular work. So don't automatically push aside even mechanically produced cells, because they're never produced in large numbers. And if you can get them within the context of the set that they came in, then you've got something that's still worth having.
That's right. That's very good. Thank you very much. I was thinking there's been a number of questions about sort of cells as artifacts. And I kind of want to think, let's talk a little bit about that, because we're talking about them now for the first time really in this auction as fine art. And to some extent, they're also artifact because, as we say, new anime are not using cell art. So do we think that that would add to the value, to the desirability, the fact that it's now a sort of a dead art?
I would think so. I mean, personally, it's breaking my heart a little bit because, you know, hand-drawn anime was so incredible. And that's one thing that Studio Ghibli is still trying to maintain at great cost and great time-consuming effort on the part of their artists. But yeah, this is, as we were saying earlier, kind of beginning to be a lost art, which is rather, as I say, heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Well, one problem with lost arts is that once you have lost them, they prove very difficult to revive. I mean, one of my passions is the history of fabric technology. And there are 4 or 5 different fabrics of which we have surviving examples, which no living weaver could reproduce. Because the loom, the technology, the thread spinning, the thread dyeing, the weight, and the complexity of these fabrics is such that it would take a weaver their entire lifetime to reproduce someone else's work. You do that, or you go on to make your own work. It's a difficult thing, and it would be a labor of love. And I think for generations, artists have gone in at the bottom in a studio, have done basic in-betweening, have worked their way up and have eventually become Hayao Miyazaki or Hideaki Anno or whoever. There's nobody now coming in at the bottom to go up that ladder, except in very few specialized areas like Ghibli. We are actually seeing that art form die. Now, when it dies, it's brutal. I mean, working in anime is brutal.
It's always been,
Parents have said that they would rather shoot their daughters than have them go and work in an animation studio. Parents have said they'd rather shoot their sons than have them go and work in an animation studio. It is hard and unrelenting, and it chews up and throws out more people than succeed. Why will people want to do that in the future if they can't get involved early and fall in love?
Right. Right. Exactly. And we see that also in adjacent arts like manga art, and even in the computer generated anime. It actually hasn't gotten all that easier despite the technology change, right?
Well, it's interesting. Somebody's just said in chat, hi Patty, said it'll come back round like pressing vinyl albums. And Dan has just said, given the working conditions, I wouldn't count on it. And I think that's it. Pressing a vinyl album is a relatively simple task if you've got the material. Making animation by hand is never going to be a simple task.
That's right, because it requires not just the technical tools, but also the physical tools of the kind of art. We have an interesting question here. I'm sorry?
Just the training, people grown up and, you know, gotten used to this sort of very arduous apprenticeship and learning how to do this.
Yes.
Exactly.
So one last thing here. Somebody asks, in all of your experiences, when does anime merchandise become art? I think that is a great question.
A god becomes a god when enough people worship them. Merchandise becomes art when enough people say this thing, this mass-produced object, or this machine-produced byproduct of the technology that made it, is so beautiful and so important that I value it on a level with the winged Nike of Samothrace, the Mona Lisa, Jeff Koons balloon dog. I mean,
and the giant Gundam at Odaiba. Yes,
exactly. We make art. We, the audience, make art as surely as the artist does. The artist puts it out and says, hey, look, this animation, cool, right? And we look at it and say, oh, cool, yeah, that's great, but let's have the next thing. Or we look at it and we say, oh, cool, that is art.
That's cool.
I think it also depends on the time and generations. There's a exhibition right now at the Metropolitan Museum in New York of Rococo art, and in relation to Disney. And incredible influence that European art, and this Rococo is very decorative and not necessarily all that highly valued originally, but as we sort of have more distance, as we kind of see how those sort of fit into the world, how it inspired other aspects of the world, I think that's true too with anime, that people are getting to take it much more seriously, and so they're seeing it. You know, it's not just the collectibles or the examples from anime; it's the whole medium itself, and sort of growth and respect and a sort of treatment of it that's very different from. I have a terrible story. My husband's mother gave away a Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs cell to a garage sale in the early 1961. He's never forgiven her for that. But it's sort of like, oh, what's this cluttering up the house?
Yeah, right. Oh, what's a Superman #1? Yeah, it's okay.
It's interesting you mentioned that exhibition, Susan, which I would love to see and won't be able to travel to see. But recently there was a major exhibition of Victoria and Albert Museum in London on Alice in Wonderland.
I wanted to see that. Yes.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Get the book, Alice Curiouser and Curiouser. It's a wonderful catalogue. But they had in this exhibition, talking about Alice, the Disney Alice, of course, all the many films that other people have been inspired to make after reading Alice. The Alice in anime section was fascinating.
Yes.
And costumes, clothes by Baby the Stars Shine Bright.
Nice.
And other Japanese designers inspired.
The Goth Woolley designer, yeah.
So it's just penetrated the culture so thoroughly.
Yeah, I want to just bring up, we have so little time. I just want to bring up one thing, and then I think we have another question. One of the things we've talked about sort of tangentially here is the artists. We've talked about how they don't often get the respect. It's too hard. It's a very hard job. And now we have something else that I want to sort of touch on. It hasn't been asked, but I feel like it's really important, is the reuse of cells as NFTs. We're starting to see this appropriation of other people's art without including the artists in this for this monetary reproduction. And Darren, we talked about this a little bit in our practice session. You want to talk a little bit about how the Rockazoo Company is perhaps reusing other people's art and monetizing it?
That's an interesting one, and I can't see it ending very well.
Okay, let me just stop. We were asked to define NFTs. They're called non-fungible tokens, and they are representations of a piece of art that you have an ownership of on blockchain. And it is very much like a cryptocurrency version of a certificate of authenticity from a plate that you hang on the wall. That's what it's an NFT is. I'm sorry, Darren, please continue.
Looking at the moment at an interesting company called Rakuma, they've been taking high quality scans of cells owned by whoever, and then vending limited runs digitally of those cells, which raises the question, do they even have the right to do that? Does possession of a piece of art give them exploitation rights? And it seems to be a bit of a gray area.
Right.
At the moment, Oh, sorry. To be quiet. So the long and the short of it is, I don't think they do.
Right.
But there still seems to be a little bit of a hoo-ha about it, because when I did consult what was going on at Rakuma, no one seems to be willing to stop them. Is it a civil crime, perhaps? Renato, you'd know this, wouldn't you? Is it criminal or is it civil? Does it require the studios to weigh in and say something to these NFT vendors?
It has to be an IP crime, really. I mean,
Yes.
it would have to be, because, and aside from that, it also seems to always cut out the artists.
Oh, of course.
You know, absolutely. And that's the part that really drives me crazy. And we had talked about this in the practice session. Shonen Jump made a big announcement. They made an announcement. They were making a big announcement this week, and everyone said no NFTs, please, no NFTs, because I think fandom is very cognizant of how dangerous that is to ownership and to artists' rights and to copyright. So I think that's something we're going to have to sort of pay attention to as well.
Actually, Erica, could I also say NFTs are utterly destructive to the environment.
Yes, they are.
The amount of work that has to be done to mine Bitcoin in a blockchain uses up more energy than most cities per blockchain. So every time you buy into this utterly pernicious market, you are helping to destroy the environment. And that is something that I think all of us can agree is not a positive thing.
Right. But in its day, did the cells that we're collecting, they're not all that great for the environment either, just not maybe in as such a direct manner.
Not in such a massive manner.
Right.
They weren't brilliant for the environment. No plastic is brilliant for the environment. And of course, humans have produced plastics in vast quantities ever since we could. But NFT is absorbing energy at such a terrifying rate that if it continues, it will probably soon, the NFT market will probably soon exceed the energy output of small, poor countries.
It's already driving up energy costs in some countries, yes. Yeah. So let's just shift to one more thing. We have a question from Renato, and Renato's saying, I think cells as auction fine arts are interesting because the raw pencil Genga that Darren mentioned are the original artworks from the minds of the artists, whereas the cell itself is only photocopied from that and then painted by a colorist working from a chart and specific instructions. Yet it's the cell that gets most of the attention, despite the fact that at that stage of production, it cannot be attributed to a single artist. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I wonder whether maybe the cell gets the attention that because to the collector, the moving image is the art. The whole movie or the whole episode is the work of art. And the cell is the closest they can get to owning a fragment of the work of art. The Genga is the closest they can get to owning the direct handwork of an artist, like owning a Rembrandt sketch as opposed to a Rembrandt etching.
Right.
But for them,
That's a great point.
The art they saw, the art they engaged with, is the animation. And therefore, even while they might accept the primacy of the Genga, the thing that they want to collect is the thing that appealed to them first.
Sure.
I think Helen has a really important point there about they want to collect the animation aspect of it. But if you want to see some extraordinary original work by Miyazaki, please go to Los Angeles, where they're having this 9-month-long special exhibit of Miyazaki's works in the brand new Museum of the Academy of Motion Pictures. And it's very awesome that these people give out the Oscars, that they decide for their first special exhibit that they would choose not an American director and not a director of live action film, but an animation director. And you see some extraordinary works of Miyazaki's original storyboards that you can see as you just kind of go through the exhibition. And again, it's part of this shift, I think, how we're thinking about not just anime, but animation in general, that it's such a gorgeous and carefully mounted and extravagant exhibition.
And what's interesting too to me is that when you see people collecting the Genga or the cells with Genga and Doga, you also get the production timing sketches, which are just a whole different piece of this still image becomes animation. So it's when you look at the collection here at Bonhams, you can see some of these things with timing sketches with the Genga, with the Doga, and other sketches. So that sort of stuff really gives you more of an insight into the process. This is part of animation and not just a still image. I think we have time for one more question. If anybody has anything, I don't see anything in chat. If anybody hasn't, we have a new message. Does anybody have anything? We have just a few more minutes. In which case, let's, what I'm going to say then is, does anyone have any last thoughts as we're going to wrap up here?
One thing I think is very important and that's emerged from everybody's discussions is that whatever reason you have for collecting cells, you better do it soon. You really had, because the supply of these things isn't infinite. And the prices are going up as more and more people realize that. So if you have, it's good advice with anything, I think. If there are things you love, get them when you can afford them. Don't put it off, because you'll have the joy of having that on your wall and owning it. And in 5 years' time, it may not be there.
And Susan, do you have any thoughts?
No, what I loved about this whole thing, again, is the fact that Bonhams, a major auction house that's been around since the 18th century, is doing, as Helen pointed out, she said it's probably the first auction of this kind in the West. And it's just an extraordinary moment. I'm really happy to have participated a little bit in it.
Yes. And Darren, do you have any last thoughts?
It's like I said in the proposal for this, trash to cash. The first time I started looking at cells, it really was a cheap way to acquire illustrations that I wouldn't otherwise have had a physical connection to the production.
Right.
Now they've been elevated by circumstance and a desire to the, well, point of being self-destructive high art.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for your insights today. It has been such a pleasure. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to Helen from Bonhams. Thank you all. And thank you for all being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we've had so many positive comments in the chat and everyone's enjoyed listening to you so much. I'm sure you could have gone on forever. But yeah, thank you so much. Your insights are so helpful. And I think, talking about the Academy Museum exhibition of Miyazaki, I think it's just amazing that, an institution like that, and they've only just, opened the museum, is having such an incredible.
Literally. Same day as the exhibit went up. Yeah.
Yeah, such an endorsement of this kind of area. which is why, you know, we think the auction's timely as well.
Yes.
I'm going to put another link to the auction in the chat so you
Thank
can
you.
all.
And I
have a
really
look.
encourage everybody in the chat to go ahead and take a look. It's got an amazing selection.
I mean,
Remember, even if you can't buy, you can look for free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's such a
exactly.
pleasure.
Looking doesn't cost anything.
No.
And I think echoing all of your thoughts, you know, I always advise people to buy what they're passionate about and what they
Yes.
love. You know, we never advise people to think of, is this a good investment? You know, buy it because you love it. And that's all
Yep.
there is to it.
Yep.
So thank you so much, everyone. You know, I'll put my email in the chat as well, in case anyone has any questions about any of the pieces or anything else that we've spoken about today.
Thank you.
But thank you so much.
Thank you all.
You.
Take care, everyone. I don't know how we end it. We'll just be sitting here forever.
Sitting here while we're chatting.
I'll end it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.